The air at Fallon Air Force Base was still, too still. The usual hum of activity engines warming. Chatter filling the hangars had been swallowed up by the biting cold. Emma Raleigh stood in the shadow of her Black Hawk, staring out at the open tarmac where the wind had started to pick up. The temperature had already dropped below freezing, but it wasn't the cold that gnawed at her. It was the silence. The storm was coming, and there was nothing she could do about it. The orders were clear, all flights grounded. There would be no flights today. No exceptions. Her eyes traced the thickening clouds, turning the sky into a dull, oppressive gray. The first flake of snow hit her cheek, cold and sharp like a reminder of what was to come. She could feel the shift in the air electric, tense. Every moment that passed felt like a weight pressing harder against her chest. She was a pilot. She was meant to fly. Yet, here she stood, grounded, watching as the storm rolled in like a living, breathing thing. The hum of the rotor, the thrill of takeoff, the feel of control under her hands. It was all a distant memory now. She could already hear the warnings from command in her head. The storm was too dangerous. No one was to leave the base until it cleared. Her fingers curled around the edge of the Black Hawk's tail rotor, the metal cold against her skin. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to care, but she did. The wind picked up, howling now, rattling the hangar doors and sending a shiver through her. She should have been inside, in the warmth, doing paperwork. That's what they told her to do, log hours. Keep the books, file reports. But outside, the world was changing. The storm was coming, and it wasn't just snow. It was a threat, a risk to lives that Emma could see in her mind's eye. Somewhere out there, a convoy of medics was stuck in the storm, radio silence hanging over them like a death sentence. The distress signal had come in just a few minutes ago, a pulse every 30 seconds, growing weaker as the batteries died in the cold. It was faint, but it was there. Someone was still alive. Someone needed help, and Emma wasn't the kind of person to just sit and wait. The rules didn't matter. The orders didn't matter. She had to fly. She turned her back to the helicopter, walking slowly towards the ready room. The base was eerily quiet, save for the faint hiss of the heater struggling to push warmth through the walls. The rest of the crew was inside, huddled together, waiting for the storm to pass. But Emma wasn't waiting. Not anymore. Her boots echoed in the hall, each step bringing her closer to the decision that was already forming in her mind. She could feel the weight of it, the enormity of what she was about to do. But she couldn't let this moment pass without action. With each passing minute, the snow grew heavier. The wind howled louder. The clock ticked down to the time when it would be too late. And Emma Raleigh, grounded and silent, felt a stirring inside her, a call to action. The storm might erase the runway lights and the radio towers. It might isolate them in the whiteout. But Emma wasn't going to wait for daylight. Not this time. She knew the stakes. If she didn't act, people would die. If she didn't act, the storm would have already won. She had to do something. And that something, it was flying. She took a breath, her resolve hardening like the frost on the helicopter's windshield. The storm could come, but she wasn't going to wait for it to bury everyone. Emma turned on her heel and headed back toward her helicopter, the cold wind biting at her face like a warning she wouldn't heed. The storm was here, and so was she. The storm could roar all it wanted. Emma was ready. The pulse of the distress beacon was the only sound breaking the stillness of the ops center. Emma stood before the monitor, watching the red dot flicker and fade with each passing second. A convoy, carrying vital medical supplies, had lost communication after reporting black ice in a rollover. The last transmission was nearly 4 hours ago, and Emma's eyes kept returning to the blinking signal on the map. It was weak, but it was there. A heartbeat fighting against the storm. The storm was already fierce, the wind screaming against the base, and visibility outside was rapidly worsening. Yet, there it was on the screen, those few slow blips. Someone was out there, stranded in the thick of it. Every second counted. The clock was ticking, and Emma's fingers clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms as she resisted the urge to act. She was grounded. Orders were orders, and the base had implemented blizzard protocol. All flights were suspended until further notice. She glanced toward the windows. The snow was swirling in a chaotic dance, and the cold air pressed in, creeping through every crack in the building. Emma knew the terrain. She had flown these mountains in every kind of weather. But right now, she was stuck in the ops center, watching a computer screen. Her eyes flickered back to the blinking red dot. She had to do something. She tried to reach command, but the response was delayed. The radio crackled, distant voices muffled by static. The usual efficiency was replaced by hesitation, the disconnect of a command structure unsure of how to proceed. Emma's frustration rose like a fire in her chest. Every second felt like an eternity. The beacon was still there, weak but persistent. Someone needed help. They needed to be found now. Her hand hovered over the radio, her fingers trembling with the weight of the decision she was about to make. She couldn't just sit and wait. The convoy's coordinates were locked, but with no visual or GPS support, finding them would be impossible without risking it all. And that was exactly what she was prepared to do. She had done it before, navigating by memory, trusting her instincts over technology. But the orders were clear. No flights. She could hear her superior's voice echoing in her mind. It had been the same every time. Emma, you're grounded. You need to let this go. The words felt like a chain, but the pulse of that beacon, a dying signal, was louder. It was a call to action that wouldn't let her ignore it. The storm outside was just a backdrop to the storm brewing inside her. Emma's resolve hardened as she thought of the lives on the line. There was no turning back now. She grabbed the headset off the desk and pushed the button to contact the ops center again. The same delayed response came through, but this time she didn't wait for them to tell her no. She had made up her mind. The storm wasn't going to stop her. She wasn't going to sit and wait while lives hung in the balance. The beacon continued its slow, rhythmic pulse, each flicker a reminder of what was at stake. She could feel the weight of it pressing on her chest. Time was running out. Emma turned, her boots echoing in the empty hallway as she walked toward the hangar. The silence of the base, once comforting, now felt like a heavy weight pressing on her shoulders. She passed through the doors to the hangar, and there it was, the Black Hawk. Standing there, she could almost hear the hum of its engines, the promise of flight. The machine that had been her companion in countless missions, the bird she knew better than any other, was waiting for her. The Black Hawk stood silent, like it knew what was coming. Her eyes narrowed, and she walked towards it, her breath fogging the air in front of her. The storm might try to bury them both, but Emma wasn't about to be silenced. She would fly. It wasn't about disobeying orders. It was about saving lives, something that meant more than any regulation. The wind howled louder now, but Emma's determination was the only thing louder than the storm outside. She had reached a point where there was no turning back. Every instinct in her screamed to act, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. As she moved toward the helicopter, she knew this wasn't just another flight. This was a mission. This was life or death, and Emma wasn't about to sit idly by while the storm raged. She grabbed the keys, her hand steady, and the decision was made. The storm would not stop her. She was the only one who could do this. Emma stood in the hangar, her breath steady despite the rush of adrenaline that surged through her veins. The Black Hawk was just ahead, its powerful frame gleaming in the dim light of the hangar, and Emma couldn't help but feel a sense of familiarity and connection to the machine. She had flown this bird through every kind of weather, through danger and uncertainty. She knew every inch of it, the way it hummed when it was right, the way it groaned when it was pushed too far. And right now, it was ready for whatever came next. She grabbed the checklist, her fingers running down the paper with practiced precision. Battery check, fuel, avionics, rotor warm-up. Every item checked off methodically, each action instinctive, like she was going through the motions of an old, familiar dance. She was grounded. She knew that, but she wasn't here to follow the rules. The storm was real. The convoy was real. And every minute that passed was a minute too long for the people out there. Emma's mind raced, the consequences of what she was about to do flashing through her thoughts. Disobeying orders, defying command, but there was no choice. Lives were on the line, and she couldn't sit here, waiting for permission that might never come. Every instinct told her to act, to move, to get in that cockpit and fly. She would be breaking protocol, risking her career, but she would do it. She was ready to fly, ready to face the storm, knowing the responsibility on her shoulders. As she turned toward the helicopter, she heard footsteps behind her. A voice called her name, and she froze. Lieutenant Peterson. He was young, freshly minted from OTS, and far too eager to follow orders. He stood a few feet behind her, his hands clasped in front of him, a tablet in one hand, his breath visible in the cold air. "Captain Raleigh," he said, his voice tentative but carrying the weight of duty. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop you." Emma didn't turn to face him. Her focus remained on the Black Hawk. "I'm not sure what you mean, Lieutenant." Peterson hesitated, his gaze flicking from her to the aircraft. "All non-essential personnel have been asked to clear the hangar. Ma'am, orders from command." She finally turned to face him, her eyes cool and unwavering. "You think I'm non-essential?" Her voice was flat, but there was an underlying edge. Peterson swallowed hard, his voice faltering. "No, ma'am, but command doesn't decide who gets to fly. I do." Emma's tone was calm, but firm. She stepped past him without another word, her boots clanging against the concrete. She could hear Peterson calling after her, but his voice became muffled as she walked toward her flight suit. She didn't need to hear him. She knew what was coming, the reprimand, the consequences. She knew she was breaking protocol, but that didn't matter now. What mattered was getting those people to safety. The urgency of it gnawed at her, but she didn't let herself hesitate. She was already in the cockpit, strapping herself in, running through the familiar pre-flight sequence. It wasn't the first time she had been grounded, but this time was different. This time, she was doing it for more than herself. Her fingers ran over the controls, the switches, each one falling into place with precision. The Black Hawk responded under her touch, alive in a way that gave her confidence. It was like coming home, like the years of training and experience were finally coming to fruition. She was in control now. She could feel the machine respond to her movements, every system running like clockwork. But beyond that, Emma felt the weight of her decision press down on her. If this went wrong, it could end her career. If she was caught, she could face court-martial. But Emma wasn't thinking about that. She was thinking about the people out there in the storm. She was thinking about the convoy. A voice crackled through her comms, a familiar voice she hadn't expected. "Captain Raleigh, are you really about to do this?" It was Mateo, her crew chief, a man she trusted with her life. He had always had her back, even when it wasn't easy. Emma didn't answer right away. She tightened the harness around her chest, checking the readouts one more time. The storm outside was relentless now, a roar in the distance, the wind howling like a beast. "I have to, Mateo." "You in or out?" she said, her voice calm, but there was a steel edge to it. There was a long pause before Mateo's voice came back, quiet but resolute. "I'm with you, Captain, always." A small smile tugged at Emma's lips, but it was fleeting. She flicked the switches, and the engine roared to life. The Black Hawk lifted off the ground, and Emma steered it toward the dark storm ahead, knowing she was about to break every rule they had ever set. But the storm wasn't going to wait for her to get permission. Every turn, every maneuver was deliberate. She had flown through worse, and this wasn't going to stop her. The storm raged around her, the wind howling against the fuselage. But Emma's focus never wavered. She knew what she was doing. She had to. The lives of those stranded in the snow were in her hands now. She was no longer just a pilot, she was the only lifeline they had. Emma's hands were steady on the controls as the Black Hawk lifted off the ground. The gusts of wind hit the aircraft like a battering ram, sending the helicopter rocking sideways, but she adjusted quickly. Her eyes flicked to the instruments, checking the rotor speed and fuel levels, making sure everything was within normal operating parameters. Outside, the world was a blur of white, the snow stinging her face through the thin gap in the cockpit's protective glass. The storm was already fierce, but Emma's focus remained unbroken, her breath even despite the rising intensity of the weather. She had flown in worse, but this was different. The stakes were higher. The Black Hawk shuddered as the winds picked up, and the familiar hum of the engine began to fluctuate. The blades sliced through the dense air, fighting against the gusts that were pushing harder than expected. Icing began to form along the leading edges of the rotor blades, and Emma felt the slight drag in the controls, the subtle difference in the way the aircraft moved. The storm was testing the limits of both the machine and her. She made an adjustment to the pitch, the cyclic responding smoothly beneath her hands, and the aircraft continued its climb, albeit slower than usual. The storm was unforgiving, but so was Emma. Visibility was dropping fast. The horizon had disappeared behind a wall of snow, and Emma relied on the analog navigation, trusting her map more than the unreliable GPS. She knew this terrain. She had flown these mountains countless times, using the shape of the ridgelines and valleys to guide her. The map, her experience, and the feeling of the Black Hawk's movements beneath her were the only things keeping her grounded in reality. She could hear the faint radio calls from the ground crew, their voices barely cutting through the static. She was too far out now, and the communication from base was becoming distant, muffled by the blizzard's roar. She glanced at the fuel gauge. It was holding steady for now, but the storm was eating up time. Every minute she spent fighting the wind brought her closer to a decision. Turn back or push forward. Turning back wasn't an option. She had committed. She could almost feel the lives of those in the convoy pulling her forward, their silent cries louder than any command from base. The ice on the rotor blades had worsened, and now the gauges were blinking warnings, But Emma's hands remained calm, a reflex, a muscle memory built over years in the cockpit. She adjusted the collective, gently easing the pressure on the engine, and the helicopter groaned but held its course. The storm outside felt alive, twisting and howling with a fury that made every movement of the helicopter feel like a battle. She could feel it in the way the machine groaned, in the way the wind buffeted the fuselage, as if the very air was trying to tear them apart. The storm was relentless, but so was she. Emma tightened her grip on the controls, her gaze locked on the instruments and the rapidly narrowing visibility. The airspeed was dropping, and she adjusted the cyclic to keep the Black Hawk steady, keeping it low enough to avoid the worst of the turbulence above. The snow outside was thickening now, the white blur of it pressing against the windshield like a curtain, blocking out everything except the pale light reflecting off the instrument panel. Emma flicked the switches to increase engine power slightly, pushing through the storm, ignoring the warnings flashing on the dash. The Black Hawk was protesting, but it was still flying. The roar of the engine, the whine of the rotor, the steady hum of the airframe, they became a symphony of resistance against the storm. She focused on the map, calculating her next move. A slight change in heading would bring them closer to the area where the convoy had been last detected. It was a gamble, but it was the only chance they had. Emma made the call, turning the Black Hawk slightly, trusting her instincts to guide her through the thickening whiteout. Each second felt like an eternity. The storm was swallowing her path, but she couldn't stop now. Every now and then, she could see faint shadows below, outlines of the mountains buried beneath the snow, just visible enough for her to maintain her course. She relied on her depth of knowledge, the years of training, to keep her heading true. But the storm was a living, breathing enemy, and every moment she spent in it felt like it was wearing her down. The Black Hawk groaned again, its systems complaining under the strain, but Emma didn't flinch. Suddenly, the radio crackled, the voice of Matteo breaking through the static. "We're getting close. Captain." Still no signal from the convoy. His voice was tight, strained, but there was no panic. She had always trusted Matteo in situations like this. "We'll find them," Emma replied, her voice steady. She could hear the strain in her own words, but she knew she couldn't afford to sound anything less than certain. The terrain was coming up fast, and she needed to focus. She scanned the instruments again. The cold, dry air filling the cockpit with a sense of urgency. The Black Hawk was pushing its limits, the engine roaring beneath her as the storm intensified. The snow was swirling around them now in a fury, and Emma fought to keep control. The wind slammed into the helicopter from every direction, but she held the course steady. There was no turning back. There was no place to hide from the storm. The tension in the cockpit was palpable, but Emma remained calm, her training taking over as her hands moved with practiced precision. The storm might have been strong, but she was stronger. She had made the decision to push forward, and now there was no choice but to see it through. The Black Hawk began to shudder again, a mechanical warning flashing across the dashboard. Emma adjusted the controls, responding to the feedback from the aircraft, and the shaking subsided slightly. She knew the storm was only getting worse, but there was no other option. They had to push through it, had to find the convoy before it was too late. Emma's hands tightened on the controls as the Black Hawk descended into the blizzard. The helicopter's blades fought the gusts, the aircraft lurching with every twist of the wind. The snow was thick, a constant white wall outside the cockpit, the ground barely visible beneath the layers of powder. She focused on the instruments, her eyes flicking between the altimeter and the rotor speed. The storm was a beast, but she was determined to face it head-on. She brought the aircraft lower, just above the treacherous ground, each inch of the descent an act of defiance. The ice was thick, the visibility near zero, but Emma didn't hesitate. The landing gear groaned as it touched down on the frozen earth, the impact sending a shudder through the helicopter. The snow piled against the fuselage, the gusts of wind clawing at the aircraft as though it were trying to tear them from the ground. The Black Hawk had made it, but Emma wasn't done yet. She swung open the side door, the bitter wind rushing in, and signaled Matteo to stay alert. The situation was critical, and every second mattered. She stepped into the snow, her boots sinking into the soft, ice-packed surface as she surveyed the wreckage. A Humvee lay on its side, half buried under snow. The tracks in the snow were erratic, some leading away from the vehicle, others ending abruptly. Emma's heart pounded as she scanned the area for signs of life. The storm was so thick that she could barely see more than a few meters in front of her. But then, through the fog of snow, she heard a cough, weak but unmistakable. Over here a voice rasped. Emma's eyes locked onto the figure crouched beneath a broken tree limb, its shape barely discernible against the snow. She moved swiftly, closing the distance, every step calculated. Her focus was sharp, her mind working faster than ever. She knelt beside the man, whose face was covered in frost and blood, his eyes barely open. The survivor had his arms wrapped around two other soldiers, one unconscious and the other shaking uncontrollably from the cold. Emma didn't hesitate. She barked orders, guiding the men as quickly as possible to the helicopter. Matteo had already dropped the winch and secured the ropes. But Emma wasn't thinking about the procedure now. She was thinking about getting them inside, keeping them alive. She lifted the man into the helicopter, her arms burning with the weight of his body. But she didn't stop. There were more to save. She rushed back into the snow, the storm howling around her like an angry beast. Her eyes scanned the wreckage again, and she saw another figure stumbling through the snow, his arms outstretched in desperation. She grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the helicopter as quickly as her legs would carry her. The snow had already started to erase their tracks, and the wind made it hard to hear anything over its ferocious howling. But Emma could hear the urgency in each footstep, each labored breath of the men she was rescuing. By the time she returned to the helicopter, Matteo had already begun to assess the survivors, making sure they were secured. But Emma wasn't finished yet. She returned to the snow a third time, her resolve unbroken, her determination stronger than the storm itself. She couldn't afford to leave anyone behind. The storm was pressing in from all sides, the winds picking up and throwing the snow into a frenzy. But Emma refused to let the blizzard win. She found the last man under a broken tree, his body half covered in snow, his breathing shallow but steady. Emma pulled him up with effort, her muscles burning from the strain. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. As they reached the helicopter, she lifted him into the waiting arms of Matteo, the last of the soldiers safe inside. The Blackhawk's rotor spun faster, the wind pressing against them. But Emma kept her focus, refusing to let the storm push her back. With all 7 men safely inside, she slammed the door shut, the sound of metal locking into place echoing through the aircraft. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes remained steady, her focus fixed on the horizon. The storm had made the rescue a near impossible feat, but they were alive. That was all that mattered. The helicopter groaned as the engines powered up again, its blades slicing through the thick snow. Emma gripped the controls, feeling the strain of the storm pushing back against her. But she didn't waver. She banked the aircraft hard, the Blackhawk responding with familiar precision despite the ice and snow, weighing down the rotors. The wind screamed against the fuselage, but Emma kept the bird steady, guiding it through the maelstrom like she had done so many times before. Matteo's voice crackled through the intercom, his tone tight but impressed. "Captain, I don't know how you did it. You're a hell of a pilot." Emma didn't respond. There was no time for words. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but she couldn't let up. The storm wasn't done yet, and neither was she. She had a mission to finish. As they gained altitude, the storm pressed against them with all its fury. But Emma held the controls firm. She could hear the blades cutting through the wind, the engine whining as the Blackhawk rose higher. The survivors in the back remained silent, their faces pale but alive, their breath steady. Emma's eyes narrowed as she scanned the instruments, calculating the path back to the base. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew she had done everything she could. The Blackhawk began to break through the storm, the blinding white snow slowly fading into clearer skies. Emma's grip on the controls didn't loosen, but for the first time since the storm had begun, she allowed herself to exhale. They were going home. As the Blackhawk touched down on the base, the usual chaos of a successful mission was absent. The rotor blades slowed, and the snowstorm outside seemed to mirror the storm inside Emma's mind. Her hands were still gripping the controls, her mind sharp despite the exhaustion that tugged at her body. The survivors' 7 soldiers she had pulled from the jaws of death were alive, because of her. But as the helicopter settled on the tarmac, she knew the fight wasn't over. Now, she had to face the consequences of defying orders. Colonel Bryce was waiting for her as she disembarked. His face was cold, unreadable, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. Behind him, a few high-ranking officers stood, their eyes on Emma like hawks. The tension in the air was thick, the silence oppressive as she approached. Emma knew this moment was inevitable. There would be no cheering, no celebration. The rules had been broken, and now she had to answer for it. "Captain Raleigh," Colonel Bryce said, his voice low and controlled. "We need to talk." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Emma could feel the weight of them pressing down on her. She stood tall, her posture straight and unwavering. Despite the anxiety that gnawed at her inside, she was prepared. She had made her choice, and now she would own it. The officers in the room exchanged looks, their disapproval clear. They were still angry, still frustrated, but Emma didn't let it show. She had done what needed to be done, and no reprimand. No reprimand would change that. She knew she had saved lives. She knew the stakes, but that didn't mean the consequences of her actions would be any less severe. "Captain, you defied direct orders," Colonel Bryce continued, his voice sharp with authority. "You disobeyed a grounded flight directive and left base without clearance. You violated protocol in a way that could have cost you everything." His words were a hammer, but Emma didn't flinch. "I understand, sir," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But I had no choice." The room fell silent at her response. She wasn't angry. She wasn't defensive. She was simply stating the truth. Bryce's eyes narrowed. But before he could say anything, the door opened. The survivors, wrapped in thermal blankets and looking pale but alive, were brought into the room. Their eyes flicked to Emma, and their expressions shifted. "Captain Raleigh," one of the men said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion, but laced with gratitude. "You saved us. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." The words hung in the room like a quiet rebuke to the officer's anger. Another soldier, this one barely able to stand, nodded in agreement. "She flew us out when no one else would. We were done for if she hadn't come." The soldiers' faces were etched with gratitude, their eyes soft with the knowledge that Emma had risked everything to get them to safety. The room went still. The officers stared at the men, their expressions hard to read. Emma's gaze never wavered. She wasn't the one who needed to defend herself anymore. The survivors had spoken, and their words carried more weight than any order from above. Colonel Bryce looked between the soldiers and Emma, his jaw tightening. The tension in the air shifted, just slightly. "I don't care how many lives you saved, Captain," he said, his voice still stern. "You broke protocol. There will be consequences." But his tone had softened just a fraction, and Emma caught it. The tide was beginning to turn, slowly. "I understand, sir," Emma replied, keeping her voice steady. But the mission was always about getting them back. The rest, she paused, allowing her words to settle. "The rest doesn't matter." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words pressing in. After a long pause, Colonel Bryce let out a breath and gave a small nod. He didn't say anything else at first. The other officers shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to proceed. Finally, Bryce spoke again, his voice softer now. "You saved lives, but you also defied orders. We'll be investigating this further." He didn't elaborate, but Emma knew what that meant. An investigation would come with its own consequences, a review of her record, a threat to her career. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she didn't let it show. She had no control over what happened next, but she knew what she had done. She had done the right thing, no matter the cost, and no matter what happened next, she would stand by that. Before she could speak again, one of the officers turned to Bryce. "Sir," the officer said, voice hesitant, "what about the men? What about the mission?" Bryce's gaze flicked over to the survivors, his face unreadable. The mission was successful. The men are alive, and that's what matters. He sighed, his voice shifting slightly. "The protocol was broken, but it seems the results speak louder than the rules. For now, we'll have to reconsider the situation." Emma didn't look at the men. She didn't need to. They had already made their point. She had made her point. As the meeting wrapped up, Emma felt the weight of the moment settle in. The consequences were still looming, but something had shifted in the room. The survivors had given her the validation she needed, but it wasn't about them. It was about knowing that, no matter what, she had acted when it mattered. The officers filed out, leaving Emma alone with her thoughts. Colonel Bryce paused at the door, his eyes meeting hers. "We'll be watching, Captain," he said, his voice quieter now. "But for now, thank you." Emma nodded, the words settling into her chest like a quiet acceptance. She had defied orders, she had broken protocol, but she had saved lives. And in the end, that would be enough. Emma stepped out of the hangar, her boots crunching against the snow-covered tarmac. The storm had passed, leaving the air cold and crisp, the night sky clear and vast above her. She had faced the consequences of her actions, but something inside her had shifted. The tension of the past few hours still clung to her, but there was a quiet sense of resolution in her chest. She had done what needed to be done, no matter the cost. And in the silence of the base, there was peace in knowing that. The base had always seen her as a ghost, a shadow moving in and out of the corridors, once grounded, once dismissed, once a symbol of what could have been, but never fully realized. Yet now, after the storm, things felt different. The soldiers she had saved, the ones she had pulled from the brink of death, would never forget her. They didn't see her as the officer who had defied orders. They saw her as the one who had given them a chance to survive when no one else would. In their eyes, she had proven that the rules were just guidelines, and that sometimes life demanded more. As Emma walked away from the hangar, she couldn't help but notice how the atmosphere had shifted. The soldiers on the ground, who had once passed her by without a second glance, now paused when they saw her. It wasn't obvious, and it wasn't loud. It wasn't a parade or a salute, but it was there, a quiet recognition, an unspoken acknowledgement of what she had done. She had earned it, even if it was nothing more than a glance, a subtle shift in the air when she entered the room. The superiors who had once seen her as a liability, as someone who couldn't be trusted, now regarded her with something different. There was still the weight of the rules, the regulations, the protocols, but beneath that, there was a new understanding. Emma didn't need their approval. The recognition she had earned, though unspoken, was all the validation she needed. She had proven herself to them. But more importantly, she had proven herself to herself. Emma walked to the edge of the base, standing in the quiet aftermath of the storm. The wind had settled, and all that was left was the stillness. The Black Hawk had long since been returned to its place in the hangar, its engines cooled and quiet. But Emma knew that it would never be just a machine to her again. It was a part of her now, a symbol of defiance, of the strength to do what was right, even when the world told her to stand down. In the distance, the silhouette of the base commander appeared, his figure cutting through the dark like a shadow. He didn't speak to her, didn't acknowledge her in any grand way. He simply passed by, his footsteps muffled in the snow, leaving Emma to stand alone. She didn't need him to say anything. The quiet weight of the moment was enough. For the first time in a long while, Emma felt a deep sense of peace. It wasn't the peace that came from a job well done or from avoiding the consequences of her actions. It was the peace that came from knowing she had done what was right. She had broken the rules, and she had risked everything to save those men. But in the end, the cost had been worth it. She hadn't been the perfect soldier. She hadn't followed every order to the letter, but she had saved lives. And in that moment, as she stood there in the cold, the quiet of the night surrounding her, Emma realized that she had become something more than she ever thought possible. The base might still see her as a ghost, but she knew the truth. She was more than a memory now. She was a symbol of courage, of defiance in the face of impossible odds, and that would stay with her. Long after the storm had passed, Emma took a deep breath, looking up at the stars in the clear night sky. For the first time in years, the weight of the world didn't feel as heavy. She had found peace, not because she had done everything perfectly, but because she had done what needed to be done. The legacy of the Ghost Run would live on, not in the reports or the orders, but in the lives that had been saved. And as Emma walked back toward the hangar, she felt something shift within her, something that had been missing for a long time. She had finally found her place in the world, and no storm, no command, could take that away.